Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Better Buildings for Humans podcast. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the podcast where we take a look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our just general joy of being alive. And of course, we have to talk about sustainable design as well. And I'm going to talk a lot about sustainable design and some very interesting things today. I want to introduce you to Matt Panaitz. Matt, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Great. I really appreciate this opportunity to tell our story. Thank you so much.
This is a really cool story. What we're going to talk about today is Long Way Home. And let's talk a little bit about you first, Matt. Tell us about your background and the path that led you to create Long Way Home.
Sure. So in 2002 and 2003, I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And that changed me for the rest of my life. It sent me on this path. And before that, I was raised in East Texas in a fairly normal suburban neighborhood. Never heard of Guatemala before I joined the Peace Corps. Never really traveled outside of the United States. And I went down there, saw that there was a need, and it changed everything.
Right on. Okay, so let's go right at it. Let's learn what Long Way Home is. Can you tell us what it is and what you're trying to accomplish with it?
Sure. So while I was a Peace Corps volunteer and I saw extreme poverty for the first time, what it did was send me to the library and I filled out the 501c3 application for a nonprofit organization. And, this was before the internet. So I did it with a pen. Then I cold called a lawyer and an accountant, and they helped me file all the paperwork. Then I bought a $500 Volkswagen Jetta and sold all of my belongings, kind of Kerouac style, and moved to Guatemala permanently. And that was in the very beginning of 2005. And we started off with building a city park because while I was a Peace Corps volunteer, the counterpart agency that I was working with, they had some land and they were never really able to develop the land. And while I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I was playing soccer with the kids in the neighborhood a whole bunch as part of the work that I was doing there. And so I went back, and from 2005 to about 2009, we built that soccer field and that entire city park. And that really built our relationships in the community. And I also started building Long Way Home, right? We didn't have a website. I didn't have, a plan to do any of this. We didn't have a strategic plan or, I was basically going on passion alone. Right. I knew I wanted to do something. I knew I wanted to keep doing that work and help people. And so as volunteers popped up and started, jumping into the construction of the park, they also helped build the organization. And then all of a sudden we have a website and a Facebook page and a source of income. And then, we started evolving and turning into a real nonprofit organization with plans.
Well, tell us about those plans. What is it that you're physically doing for the people in Guatemala?
So after we built the park, and while we were building the park, what we saw was that our neighbors were living in fairly difficult situations, right? And so what we saw, they didn't have water because we lived in the same area. We didn't live in a tourist town and then come back for the weekends or, during the week to come and help. We moved into the area to live amongst the people and live as they live while we were building the park. And that meant for us that we didn't have water and we didn't have reliable electricity. I think at some point we were running an extension cord 600 feet from the neighbor's house so that we could actually have electricity. And then we would go hang out with the neighbors and we would see how the neighbors were living, and they were living without stoves, without bathrooms, without water. And their houses were, not great homes as well. And so we decided that we wanted to, once we finished the park, we wanted to deal with some of the more pressing issues. And those pressing issues we were going to scale because we wanted to build those issues into what was happening within the school so that students and teachers could work on these things. And that led us to build the Hero School campus. And so I told the co-founder of Long Way Home, I was like, I would like to build a school. And he says to me, have you ever heard of building a school out of trash? And I had never heard of building a school out of trash. We bought a book, put the book on the ground, got our first tires, and started the construction of this campus. And yeah, we're, it's 17 years later and we're still not totally done. We have most of the infrastructure done, but we haven't totally finished.
Was there, any particular insight or moment or something that your co-founder saw online, or I'm not even sure you were online at this point at all, but was there anything particular that sparked the idea of building from trash? Was that, that's all you had available, that's all your budget could afford, or it was just, you knew you could pull it off if you did it this way? What drove you to say that's the answer?
Well, when you look around Guatemala, you notice that there's a lot of trash on the ground because there is not a reliable way to remove trash. People burn, bury, or throw their trash in the ravine mostly. And we saw all this trash on the ground, and we were both builders, and we wanted to, start thinking about sustainable living. And yeah, we bought Earthship Volume 1. And within the book called Earthship Volume 1, it explained how you build a structure out of tires. And that opened the door to really building with trash. We also saw there's a lake called Lake Atitlan that is a few hours away. And we also saw that there was a woman there and she was building exterior fences around her school. And she was building those fences using plastic bottles filled with trash. And so we actually at some point started charging people plastic bottles filled with trash to get into our park so that we could increase the flow of rubbish needed to also help build the school. So, we were dealing with a whole bunch of issues at one time. We were cleaning up, we were exploring sustainable living techniques, experimenting with new buildings, and that sort of sent us off to the races in the sustainable living and building world.
Do you want to bring lots of healthy, beautiful, natural light in your building and still meet energy codes? Try Solera from Advanced Glazings. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. That sounds fantastic. Let's get our hands dirty for a second, Matt. Tell me how you attach, bottles full of trash together to form a wall or whatever it is that you were using those building blocks for.
Yeah, sure. So our first building was built out of tires, and we were whenever you build with tires, you stack them like you would a cinder block or a red brick, but it creates this void because they're staggered. And then you put the trash bottle into the void and you cover that trash bottle with mud. That is one way to do it, to get the trash out of the waste stream. And then another way we do it is like once we got to the top layer of tires, which was 11 courses up, and then we put the roof on, and then we wanted to fill some of the voids between the roof and that top layer of tires and the trash bottles. And we also used cob in between the trash bottles. That helped us fill that void. We also will build with columns, right? And in between the columns, we would put plastic bottles standing up, right, vertically, and then put chicken wire on either side, and then use tie wire to keep it close, and then put the plastic bottles in between the tie wire, and then go all the way up the wall. We built another building where we used cob and we laid the bottles flat. And then we put different layers of cob in between the bottles and then built the bottles up. And we did that in a dome type structure. So there's a bunch of ways that you can actually use plastic bottles filled with trash. You can use 3-liter bottles. There's a variety.
Is there any concern about, quality control? Is there any worries that a bottle full of trash may contain some nasty stuff that you don't want people coming into contact with, or that might be volatile, that's releasing, undesirables into the interior of the building?
Yeah, we have a tendency to inspect each one of those bottles before we
Okay.
use them, and we will pop the cap off, and you can kind of tell what's going on inside of the bottle. But also, by the time that you have 3 to 4 inches of finishes on the outside of the bottle, everything is really well enclosed. It's not getting sun exposure. There's not a lot of particle movement on the inside of those bottles or the inside of that wall.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Some specific projects, Matt, that I saw on your website that I'd like to hear about. The first one, I think you mentioned already. It's a two-story dome. Can you tell us about the two-story dome, why it's interesting, why it's two stories, and what's really important about it? What are the lessons there that we could share?
Sure. So the first building we did was tires. And then after, feeling pretty comfortable with building with tires, we wanted to try out the next thing, which was earth bags, right? Because our campus really is, we're experimenting. We were wanting to build infrastructure in the community to, help people have all other options than basically cinder block. In Comalapa, everybody uses cinder block, and cinder block isn't the warmest material, right? And so we used tires, and that went pretty well. And then we decided to use earth bags, and the earth bags are 20 feet across at the bottom. So if we're building a dome, we also needed to go 20 feet high. And yeah, so when you go 20 feet high, you have the option of putting a floor in between, once you get to that 10 feet. And we put three 20-foot buildings next to each other and then kind of turned that all into an outside terrace, right? And so we made them rounds because there's a lot of earthquakes in the area as well, and then tied them back to a retaining wall. So that was another exploration for us, trying earth bags in this region. Now, what we weren't thrilled about with the earth bags was they're highly technical. You have to get it exactly right. And so that was unlikely to be replicated. Plus, they don't use a whole lot. Well, they don't use any rubbish. They're polypropylene bags filled with mostly dirt, sand. And, we have to amend the soil. And so we want to use this and remove as much rubbish as we possibly can. And the earth bags didn't really do that.
Right. You're only getting half the benefit. So there was another project mentioned on there called the triple earth bag dome. That's what you've already spoken of with regard
Yeah.
to a triple.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why is it called a triple earth bag? Just out of curiosity.
Well, I call it triple earth bag because there's three buildings right next to each other.
Oh, I see.
Right. And there's
Yeah.
three 20-foot domes right next to each other. And there is the other one, actually, that you were talking about before. That one is actually tires on the bottom and then earth bags in the middle, and then plastic bottles filled with trash on top of that. Right. So the first story, the back side of the wall is tires, the front side is earth bags. Then we put a concrete floor. Then we did plastic bottles filled with trash.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Were the locals participating in this? Like, were they developing the skills as you guys were developing the skills too, or?
Yeah, so whenever you go there, you find that there's a lot of builders, and most of these builders build with cinder block. And so they understand the concept of things being level and things being plumb. And
Yeah.
then when we said, hey, we want to apply these concepts to tires and earth bags, they understood that. But no, not a single one of them had ever done anything like this.
Yeah.
And we hadn't really either. So we were all exploring these concepts together, and we relied on them to get our materials, right? If you want
Right.
sand, you ask the locals. If you want gravel, you ask the locals. We completely relied on the local builders to access materials and to also, think through these concepts and try them out. And when they fail, tear them down and start over. Yeah, it was a very integrated process.
Yeah, very cool. I mean, you want the skills and the learnings left with the community, right? Otherwise, everything you did dies in 10 years or 20 years or whatever the lifespan is. And I should ask that. How long do these structures last, Matt?
Yeah, they're still there.
Okay.
And we were living in these structures while we were building them as well. So that was kind of our thing, was build a structure, live in it, then build another structure, and then another person could live in that one. And we
Right.
felt the earthquakes while we were living in them, right? So we got to test them for a whole lot of years before we actually ever put any students in these buildings. And now, it's been 10, 15 years later, and you'll see the occasional crack in the finishes, but no, there has been no movement. The buildings have not settled in any particular negative way. They're still there, they're still thriving, and we're impressed with how well it was actually done.
That's a story that needs to be told more broadly for sure. All right, let's talk about occupant comfort. And I know this is a bit of a stretch when you're working with something so very basic, but let's talk about it anyway. Like, fresh air, I don't think fresh air would be an issue, but natural light, thermal comfort, those kinds of things, Matt, did that come into the design at all? Or are we just absolutely getting the minimum in terms of keeping people protected and sheltered?
No, our building has a south face. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And so we get full sun exposure all day long. And there's a lot of windows. So when you walk into one of the classrooms, it's pretty well always 70 degrees. The temperature
Okay.
doesn't change. So even as where we are is a pretty cold area, right? Because we're at 7,000 feet in the mountains. And so if you're cold and you walk into these buildings, you're immediately not cold anymore. And because of that south face, and we have lots of windows, so lots of natural lighting. And whenever you ask our students what is their favorite thing about these buildings, they always say that they love that they're not square, that every other building they go into everywhere else is square or has 90-degree angles, and that they love how roundish our buildings are. They love the curves, they love the feeling of being inside a building that, naturally makes more sense to them.
That is really interesting. Do you think that's unique to that culture, or is it a broader thing for people to avoid corners? Do we feel better when there's no corners?
Well, I would say that our furniture was resistant to it
Right.
because tables, chairs,
Yeah.
we're not used to living, or we don't have furniture for circular buildings, right? So I resisted it at first because I hate it that I can't really push a bed flat up against the wall.
Right. Because you're
However,
wasting space. Yeah.
right, it feels like you're wasting a little bit of space. However, I
Yeah.
really like the feeling of the building. And as far as the locals go, I would say it's something similar. I don't think they had experienced many roundish type walls. But then we all came around really fast because our classrooms, there are chairs that follow the wall. And so, the classrooms are more of a circular setting, which I think is better for teaching. And I think the teachers appreciate that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's no question about that. I want to talk about how you take this to the world, how you spread this. First of all, are there any limits on where these ideas can be implemented? Does it have to be in a mountain village, or will these concepts work in a desert? Will these concepts work in a flat jungle? Are there any geographical and climate related limitations on where you can use these ideas, Matt?
Yes, the people that started this, they're out in Taos, New Mexico. And I'm not
Okay.
sure if you've ever been to Taos, but Taos can
No.
get real cold, below zero, and can get above 100 degrees. And I lived in the houses that these guys built, and you would not know what the temperature is outside when you're inside of these buildings, and there was no central heat or air, right? So these buildings work in the desert. We've seen them built in the jungle. We've seen them built at the beach, in the mountains. Really, like, there's not a lot of locations where it doesn't make sense other than in the city, right? Because you can't go up very high with these buildings. I suppose if
Right.
you wanted to, you could go tires and then terrace and then tires. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the city,
Right.
right? So they make more sense where there's a little bit of space. So, the preference would be a rural area.
Solar heat gain doesn't have to be a design challenge. Solera translucent glazing units help architects create buildings that not only work better, but feel better, balancing light, comfort, and energy efficiency. Discover how to design higher value spaces without compromise at advancedglazings.com.
Right on. Okay. So do you have any plans to do this? Is there any thoughts, any sort of big strategic plan for a broader sort of rollout?
Yeah. So what we've seen is that people from all over the world came to our campus, right? And they practiced sustainable living techniques with us. And then they brought them back to their communities and replicated aspects of what we did, right? Certain people built tire structures, they built earth bag domes. What we were hoping while we were building this campus, because we did it all very publicly, people would stop by from, you know, in addition to all over the world, but locals from all over the country would stop by, bring busloads of kids to check our campus out. Because we got a lot of good publicity, whenever a news reporter stops by and sees a whole bunch of people building with rubbish out in the middle of nowhere, it's a pretty cool story. And they'll throw it in the newspaper or they'll interview us. And that happened over the course of the entire time. So we were really expecting that more people would pick it up. Now, this is kind of interesting. So we build tire retaining walls. That's probably the most popular thing that is replicated. Whenever we started collecting tires for the buildings that we were doing, we would take a flatbed truck along the Inter-American Highway, and there's little mom and pop tire shops all over the place. Well, each one of them has a stack of 10 or 15 out front, and we would throw them in the back of our truck, and they would go, here, take them. We don't need them. We're going to have to pay to get rid of them anyway, so you're doing us a favor.
Right.
15 years later, they're charging us for them because now everybody wants them, mostly because of the retaining walls, because the retaining walls make so much sense. Instead of doing concrete or rock, which is expensive and doesn't necessarily last forever, mortar joints deteriorate. If you use an 18-wheeler tire and you throw 12 wheelbarrows of dirt, it's not going anywhere for a really long time, right? And so yeah, the replicability of it didn't go exactly as we had hoped with the buildings. And so that gave us the idea to take what we learned while building the campus and work that into the lesson plans for our students, right? And so now the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th graders, they're building stoves, water tanks, compost latrines, retaining walls, and structures so that it makes their education more relevant, makes it more interesting. Plus, we're also addressing one of the biggest issues is the amount of poverty in this area. And whenever we do, because we had all this experience on our campus building with all of this rubbish, we have figured out that we can cut the cost on a lot of the infrastructure that we're building in the community to fight poverty. And so that has interest. And that's how we replicate. We build it in systematically to the education system. That gives us short, medium, and long-term impact.
That's genius. Is anyone else calling you? Like, are there other countries that are saying, hey, come to Belize or come to, Venezuela and help us out?
Yeah, we've been to South Africa was probably the biggest trip for us. Somebody came to one of our projects we were building a house for a family in Comalapa in Guatemala. And somebody from South Africa came to that project. And then she said, hey, I want you to help build an orphanage building in the Free State in South Africa. So I brought 5 Guatemalans from our team to South Africa. Now, these are guys that had rarely left town, right? And now they're on an airplane going to South Africa to build an orphanage building in, a pretty remote location. which was great for them because they got to see South Africa. But they were also, in a sense, like respected in by being invited as some of the best green builders in the world. Now, while we were building that orphanage building, somebody else from South Africa came to volunteer on that project and said, hey, we would like you to come to Cape Town and build a school there. So we've also done a little work in Cape Town. We've been to Sierra Leone, Colombia, Venezuela, and we would go to more places, but really it's a matter of funding. We get requests all the time, right? Most of the people in the NGO world and the sustainable living world see this as, kind of a no-brainer. Like if we're going to build, we might as well build responsibly. What it comes down to, it costs money to move us around, and that adds costs to the buildings, right? And so that would be the only thing that would stop us from doing this in a whole lot more locations.
Do you record this like so they can show YouTube videos and stuff like that so that the knowledge it gets diffused more, Matt? Or
yeah, we created a comprehensive webpage that is called lwhomegreen.org. And so we did video, we have a whole lot of photographs, sequence photographs. We added materials lists, we added animated videos, YouTube videos. We documented the entire process of all of the buildings because while we were doing it, we didn't really have a lot of access to resources as reference material, right? And so, yeah, we put all this on our webpage so that it would be easier for anybody else doing it in the future.
Love it. That's amazing and highly commendable. Two things I want to talk about before we start to wrap this up. The first one is, I'll say, sort of cultural ethics side of it. I'll just say this directly. The rich Canadian or the rich American coming down, and we're going to show you how it's done. How do you approach the fact that maybe there's some resentment, or is there any resentment when somebody comes in from away to be we're the great hope here? There's got to be a way of making sure that you're truly viewed by the community as being useful and helpful, as opposed to somebody that's just trying to fill their ego or build their resume.
Yeah, it's a really important question. And our approach was to do this over a long period of time, right? If you've only got 2 weeks, you kind of have to push people and go, okay, this is the way we're doing it. You don't have time to slowly let things roll out. And that we're 20 years into this, and we're 20 years into the slow rollout. And we didn't say, hey, we have to do this building over a week. We spent, if you think about it, like Peace Corps is basically a couple of years of getting to know everybody. And who spends 2 years getting to know everybody, right? And then on top of that, we built the city park, right? And then the city park is, Guatemala is a soccer country, and we built the first grass soccer field. We made a lot of friends by building the first grass soccer field in the history of that town. And then we played soccer with the people, right? I was playing soccer 7 days a week because we actually lived at the park, and then got to know people and then had lunch with them and, invited to birthday parties and weddings. We really took our time to get to know them. And then on top of that, what we saw was hard work will do it, right? So if you are sitting in an office and you go, okay, local people, please take these sledgehammers and put this dirt into these tires and do it for 9 hours and I'm going to watch, that can build some resentment, right? What we did was stand right next to them and we built with them. We took the sledgehammers, we built, we packed the tires, we did as much or more than anybody else. And whenever you're standing next to a local and you're packing a tire and they're packing a tire, you become friends, right? You talk about families, you talk about life. You spend 45 hours a week doing this, eating lunch with each other, hanging out, and you become family, you become friends. And there's really no way to rush that, right? And so because we have done this over such a long period of time, we have earned trust and respect.
Wonderful. That's a great lesson for everybody. Matt, what's next for Long Way Home and for yourself?
Yeah, well, we expect that what we're doing can be implemented on a larger scale. And I'm doing a doctorate in education right now because I would like to take a systematic approach to integrating what we're experimenting with and building it into lesson plans, right? And so right now we have a couple hundred students at our school, and they're doing infrastructure for local families, but we would like to see all of the public schools in town doing infrastructure for the families. But what we have to do is roll that out. We have to prove the model, and we have to introduce all of these concepts to the other public schools, because what we're talking about is eradicating poverty and using subject matter at public school to do that. That might be the first place on earth where it's happening at that scale, and really integrating the people in the community into that overall effort.
Oh, I love it. Matt, that's absolutely brilliant. And I'm so honored to have had a chance to chat with you. All right. I have a question that I ask every guest, Matt, and I ask them to answer the question from whatever perspective they see fit. Okay. Here's the question. What makes a great building?
Safe. Number one is safety and not having to add heating and air conditioning. I love not having to pay an electric bill, and using natural materials in that building. Those are my preferences, and that's what I think makes a great building, is a lot of light as well. We add glass bottles to the roof, and so it kind of looks like a cathedral as well. Yeah, so
it does some diffusion too, so it should take away some of the glare issues as well by using the bottles on the roof.
We harvest water with our buildings as well. Try to keep life simple and inclusive within that building.
Oh, just amazing. A lot of great ideas there, and I hope people steal your ideas like crazy, because these are the things that are going to, make the real changes over the long term. Matt, tell us your website again.
We are lwhome.org.
lwhome.org. Okay. And if people were interested in volunteering or helping or contributing or just making a donation, is that where they'd go, to that same website?
Absolutely. And you can also email me directly. I'm matt@lwhome.org. And we're looking for volunteers. And of course, we need donations.
Right on. All right. Matt, thank you so much. What a marvelous thing you're doing. A wonderful conversation too. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. Have a great day.
All right. You take care.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.